Welcome back to Crowned Black Heroes, where we uncover the stories that changed the world but were deliberately hidden from history. Today, I'm going to tell you about a woman whose cells have saved billions of lives. Her cells were used to develop the polio vaccine that eradicated one of the most feared diseases in human history. Her cells were used in research that won Nobel Prizes. Her cells were used to develop treatments for AIDS, cancer, Parkinson's disease. Her cells have been used in over 110,000 scientific studies. Her cells have generated billions of dollars for pharmaceutical companies and research institutions. Her cells were so important that they were sent into space to study the effects of zero gravity on human tissue. This woman's contribution to medicine is literally incalculable. Every person who has received a polio vaccine, every person whose life was saved by medical research over the past 70 years owes something to this woman. But she never knew any of this was happening. She never gave permission for her cells to be used. She never received a single dollar in compensation. And for decades, her family couldn't even afford health insurance while companies were making fortunes from her cells. Her name was Henrietta Lacks, and this is the story of how the medical establishment took her cells without consent, built an empire on her biology, and then tried to forget she ever existed. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we bring you these powerful, untold stories every single week. And if this story makes you angry about medical exploitation and racial injustice, smash that like button and drop a comment. Now let me tell you about Henrietta Lacks, the immortal woman whose cells changed medicine forever while her family struggled in poverty. We begin on August 1st, 1920, in Roanoke, Virginia. A baby girl is born to Eliza and Johnny Pleasant. They name her Loretta Pleasant, though she will later be called Henrietta. Henrietta grows up in the Jim Crow South, in poverty, working on a tobacco farm in rural Virginia. Her mother dies when Henrietta is just 4 years old. After her mother's death, Henrietta is sent to live with her grandfather in Clover, Virginia, in a small cabin that had once been slave quarters. This is where Henrietta spends her childhood, working in the tobacco fields alongside her cousins. The work is brutal, the kind of back-breaking, labor that destroys bodies, but it's survival. The Great Depression makes everything worse, and black families in rural Virginia have almost nothing. But Henrietta is strong, resilient, full of life. She has a beautiful smile and a presence that makes people notice her. As a teenager, Henrietta begins a relationship with her cousin David Lacks, which might sound unusual today, but was not uncommon in rural communities where people had limited options for meeting potential partners. In 1935, when Henrietta is 14, she gives birth to her first child, a son named Lawrence. In 1939, she has a daughter named Elsie, who is born with severe developmental disabilities, probably what we would today recognize as epilepsy and cognitive impairment. In 1941, Henrietta and David get married. They continue working the tobacco fields, barely scraping by, but they have each other and their growing family. In 1943, with World War II, creating job opportunities in northern cities, David and Henrietta make the decision that thousands of black Southern families were making during the Great Migration. They move to Baltimore, Maryland, seeking better opportunities. David finds work at a steel mill and they settle in Turner Station, a black community outside Baltimore. Life in Baltimore is better than life on a tobacco farm, but it's still hard. They're poor, living in a small house, raising their children. Henrietta has 3 more children after moving to Baltimore: David Jr., Deborah, and Joseph. She's a devoted mother, taking care of 5 children while also working when she can. By all accounts, Henrietta is vivacious, stylish despite having little money, someone who lights up a room. Her cousin and childhood friend Sadie remembers her as someone who always dressed nicely, who took pride in her appearance, who had a fierce love for her children. In late 1950, Henrietta begins experiencing symptoms that terrify her. She's bleeding between menstrual periods. She has severe abdominal pain. She feels a knot inside her that she describes to her cousins as a lump. She's worried, but like many poor people, especially poor black people in 1950, Henrietta doesn't have easy access to health care. She doesn't have health insurance. She can't afford private doctors. But her symptoms are getting worse, and she knows something is seriously wrong. In January 1951, Henrietta goes to Johns Hopkins Hospital, the only hospital in the area that treats black patients. Other hospitals either turn black patients away entirely or have segregated wards with inferior care. Johns Hopkins has a ward for black patients, and while it's still segregated, it at least provides care. Henrietta sees a gynecologist who examines her and is alarmed by what he finds. There's a large malignant tumor on her cervix. Henrietta has cervical cancer, and it's already advanced. The doctor, Howard Jones, takes a biopsy of the tumor to confirm the diagnosis. This is standard medical procedure. What happens next is not standard, or at least it shouldn't be, but in 1951, it's depressingly common. During the biopsy, without asking Henrietta's permission, without even informing her, Dr. Jones takes an additional sample of her cells and sends them to Dr. George Gee, the head of tissue culture research at Johns Hopkins. Dr. Gee has been trying for years to grow human cells in laboratory conditions. He needs living human cells that can survive and reproduce outside the body for his research, but every cell sample he's tried has died after a few divisions. He's been collecting cell samples from every patient at Johns Hopkins who has a biopsy or surgery, taking samples without the patient's knowledge or consent, hoping to find cells that will survive. When Dr. Gee receives Henrietta's cells, something extraordinary happens. The cells don't die, they thrive. They reproduce at an incredible rate, doubling every 20 to 24 hours. Dr. Gee has finally found what he's been searching for: immortal human cells that can be cultured indefinitely in laboratory conditions. He names them HeLa cells, using the first two letters of Henrietta's first and last names. Meanwhile, Henrietta is fighting for her life. She undergoes treatment for her cancer, which in 1951 means radium tubes inserted into her cervix, a painful and primitive treatment. The radiation makes her sick, burns her skin, causes terrible side effects. But the cancer is aggressive, and the treatment isn't working. The cancer spreads throughout her body. Henrietta's family watches helplessly as she deteriorates. She's in terrible pain. By September 1951, Henrietta is hospitalized full-time. Her cousin Sadie visits her and is shocked by how much pain Henrietta is in. The doctors give her morphine, but it's not enough. Henrietta Lacks dies on October 4th, 1951. She's 31 years old. She leaves behind a husband and 5 children, including Elsie, who is institutionalized, and Deborah, who is just an infant. Henrietta's family is devastated. They're also broke. They can barely afford to bury her. Henrietta is buried in an unmarked grave in a family cemetery in Clover, Virginia, back where she grew up. Her family grieves and tries to move on, struggling financially and emotionally. But while Henrietta's family struggles, while they mourn, and bury their mother and wife in an unmarked grave, something else is happening. Dr. George Gee is growing HeLa cells by the millions. He's sharing them with researchers around the world. Within a year of Henrietta's death, HeLa cells are being shipped to laboratories across America and internationally. They're being used in research on viruses, on cancer, on the effects of radiation. Scientists are ecstatic. For the first time, they have human cells that can be studied in laboratory conditions, cells that don't die, cells that can be grown in unlimited quantities. HeLa cells become the foundation of modern cell biology. In 1952, a young scientist named Jonas Salk is working on developing a vaccine for polio. Polio is one of the most feared diseases in America. It paralyzes children, kills thousands, causes parents to live in terror every summer when polio outbreaks are most common. Salk needs to test his vaccine, but he needs massive quantities of human cells to grow the polio virus and test whether his vaccine works. HeLa cells provide the solution. Millions of HeLa cells are used to test the polio vaccine. The vaccine works. In 1955, the Salk polio vaccine is declared safe and effective. Mass vaccination campaigns begin. Within a few years, polio is nearly eradicated in America. This is one of the great public health triumphs of the 20th century. Millions of children who would have been paralyzed or killed by polio grow up healthy because of the polio vaccine. And that vaccine was developed using Henrietta Lacks' cells. But Henrietta's family knows nothing about this. They have no idea that Henrietta's cells are alive in laboratories around the world, that they're being used in life-saving research, that her contribution to medicine is literally incalculable. Through the 1950s and 60s and 70s, HeLa cells become increasingly important to medical research. They're used to study how cells divide, how viruses infect cells, how cancer develops. They're used to test the effects of drugs and radiation and toxins. They're used in research on AIDS, on genetic diseases, on infertility treatments. They're used in the development of in vitro fertilization. They're used in cloning research. They're sent into space on early space missions to study how zero gravity affects human cells. By the 1970s, HeLa cells have been used in research that wins Nobel Prizes. They've generated countless scientific papers and discoveries. And they've become a commercial product. Biotech companies are selling HeLa cells to research laboratories around the world. A vial of HeLa cells might cost hundreds of dollars. Millions of vials are sold. The biotech industry is making enormous profits from Henrietta Lacks' cells, and her family still knows nothing. They're living in poverty in Baltimore. David Lacks works at the steel mill until he can't anymore. The children grow up poor, struggling with the loss of their mother. Deborah, who was just an infant when Henrietta died, grows up with only vague memories and stories about the mother she barely knew. In 1973, more than 20 years after Henrietta's death, the Lacks family gets a strange phone call. A scientist calls and asks if they can take blood samples from Henrietta's children. The family is confused. Why would scientists want their blood? The scientist explains vaguely that it's for research, but doesn't provide details. The family agrees, thinking maybe this is somehow related to helping medical research, not understanding what's really going on. It's only after this phone call that the family begins to learn the truth. Through a series of confusing conversations and incomplete explanations, they start to understand that Henrietta's cells are still alive, that they're being used in research all over the world. But they don't fully grasp the scope or the implications. In 1975, a reporter contacts the Lacks family. He's writing a story about HeLa cells and wants to talk about Henrietta. The family is shocked. They read articles about HeLa cells, about how important they are to science, about how they've been used in research for decades. They learn that HeLa cells have been bought and sold, that companies are making money from them. And they realize that while the medical establishment and biotech companies have profited enormously from Henrietta's cells, her own family has received nothing. Not compensation, not even acknowledgement. Henrietta's children can't afford health insurance. They struggle to pay for medical care. And yet their mother's cells, taken without permission, are being sold around the world. The injustice is staggering. To make matters worse, in the 1970s, scientists publish Henrietta's medical records without her family's consent. They publish her name, her medical history, even information about her family members. The family's privacy is violated. They learn intimate details about Henrietta's illness by reading about it in scientific journals. They're not consulted. They're not asked for permission. They're treated as irrelevant to a story that's fundamentally about their mother, their wife, their family. The Lacks family tries to understand what happened and why. They're angry, confused, hurt. They want answers, but the medical establishment is not forthcoming. Scientists and institutions that have benefited from HeLa cells are defensive. They argue that the science is what matters, that individual patients' identities are less important than the research. They argue that in 1951, it was standard practice to take tissue samples without explicit consent. This is true, but it doesn't make it right. And it doesn't explain why decades later, when the family was identified and the story became known, no one thought to compensate them or even properly acknowledge what had been taken. The issue of consent in medical research is complex. In 1951, there were essentially no regulations requiring informed consent for tissue samples. Doctors routinely took samples during biopsies or surgeries and used them for research without telling patients. This was considered acceptable medical practice. It wasn't until the 1970s, largely in response to horrific revelations about experiments like the Tuskegee syphilis study, that regulations requiring informed consent were implemented. So technically, Dr. Gay and Johns Hopkins didn't break any laws by taking Henrietta's cells without her consent. But legality and morality are not the same thing. Taking someone's cells without their knowledge, using those cells to develop products and research that generate billions of dollars, and then never acknowledging or compensating the person or their family is morally wrong regardless of what the law said. And the fact that this happened to a poor, Black woman is not coincidental. The medical establishment has a long history of exploiting marginalized people for research. Black people, poor people, prisoners, people with disabilities, these are the populations that have been used in medical experiments without their consent throughout American history. The Tuskegee syphilis study, where Black men were deliberately left untreated for syphilis so doctors could study the disease's progression, is the most famous example. But there are countless others. Henrietta Lacks is part of this history, a history of medical racism and exploitation. For decades, the Lacks family struggled with how to think about Henrietta's legacy. On one hand, her cells had contributed to life-saving research. Millions of people were healthier because of HeLa cells. That's something to be proud of, a legacy that any family would want to honor. But on the other hand, that contribution was taken without consent. The family was excluded and ignored, and others had profited while the family remained poor. How do you reconcile those two realities? Deborah Lacks, Henrietta's daughter, became the family member most invested in understanding her mother's story. Deborah was just an infant when Henrietta died, so she had almost no memories of her mother. Learning about HeLa cells became a way for Deborah to connect with the mother she never knew. But it was also painful and confusing. Deborah wanted to honor her mother's contribution to science, but she also wanted acknowledgement and respect for her mother as a human being, not just as a source of cells. In 2000, a journalist named Rebecca Skloot began researching Henrietta's story. Rebecca spent years tracking down the Lacks family, gaining their trust, researching the history of HeLa cells and the broader context of race and medical ethics. Rebecca became close with Deborah, and together they tried to piece together Henrietta's life and legacy. In 2010, Rebecca published The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, a book that told Henrietta's story in full for the first time. The book was a massive bestseller. It was praised by critics, won numerous awards, and brought Henrietta's story to millions of readers who had never heard of her. Suddenly, Henrietta Lacks was no longer an obscure footnote in medical history. She was recognized as a crucial figure whose contribution to medicine needed to be acknowledged and honored. The book also sparked renewed debate about medical ethics, about consent, about who profits from medical research, and about how we acknowledge the people whose bodies contribute to scientific advances. In 2013, the National Institutes of Health reached an agreement with the Lacks family, giving them some input over how Henrietta's genetic information is used in research. This was a small acknowledgement, but it was something. It recognized the family's connection to Henrietta's cells and gave them a voice in decisions about genetic research using HeLa cells. In 2017, HBO produced a movie adaptation of Rebecca Skloot's book, starring Oprah Winfrey as Deborah Lacks. The movie brought Henrietta's story to an even larger audience. Millions of people watched and learned about this woman whose cells had been taken without consent and used to change medicine. The visibility was important, but visibility doesn't pay bills. The Lacks family, while grateful for the recognition, was still not so, receiving any compensation for the billions of dollars generated by HeLa cells. Companies were still selling HeLa cells and making profits. The family was still struggling financially. In 2021, 70 years after Henrietta's death, the Lacks family filed a lawsuit against Thermo Fisher Scientific, a biotech company that sells HeLa cells. The lawsuit argued that the company had unjustly enriched itself by commercializing Henrietta's cells without the family's consent. This was a groundbreaking legal action, testing whether families have rights to tissue that was taken from their relatives decades ago. In 2023, the case was settled out of court. The terms of the settlement were not disclosed, but the family received some form of compensation. Finally, more than 70 years after Henrietta's cells were taken, her family received something. It's impossible to know if the compensation was adequate. How do you put a price on cells that have contributed to over 100,000 scientific studies, that have been used in Nobel Prize-winning research, that have generated billions of dollars in profits? But at least there was acknowledgement. At least there was some form of justice, however delayed and incomplete. Henrietta's story raises fundamental questions about medical ethics that remain relevant today. Who owns your body? If doctors take tissue from your body during a medical procedure, who owns that tissue? Can it be used for research without your consent? Can it be commercialized? Should you or your family receive compensation if that tissue is used to develop profitable products? These are not abstract questions. These are issues that affect anyone who has surgery, anyone who has blood drawn, anyone who participates in medical research. Current regulations require informed consent for research, but the rules around tissue samples are still murky. Many people don't realize that when they have surgery, the tissue that's removed might be used for research or even commercialized. There have been other cases similar to Henrietta's. John Moore, a man whose spleen cells were used to develop a cell line worth billions of dollars, sued for compensation and lost. The court ruled that he had no ownership rights to his own cells once they were removed from his body. This ruling is controversial, and many people believe it's unjust. Why should companies and researchers profit from someone's biological material without compensating the person or their family? The counterargument is that requiring consent and compensation would slow down medical research, would create a burden that would hinder scientific progress. There's also concern about people viewing their tissue as property to be sold, creating a market for human biological material that could be exploitative. These are legitimate concerns, but they don't justify what happened to Henrietta Lacks. There's a middle ground between completely unregulated taking of tissue and creating a commercial market. That middle ground includes informed consent, transparency, and some form of benefit sharing when tissue is used for commercial purposes. Henrietta's story is also inseparable from the history of medical racism. The fact that her cells were taken without consent, the fact that her family was ignored and excluded, the fact that others profited while her family remained poor, none of this is accidental. This is part of a pattern of how the medical establishment has treated black bodies throughout American history. From the era of slavery, when enslaved people were used in medical experiments, to the post-Civil War period when black people's bodies were used for medical training without consent, to the 20th century with cases like Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks, there's a consistent theme. Black bodies are viewed as resources to be used for the benefit of others, particularly white others. Black people's autonomy, their humanity, their right to control what happens to their own bodies, is repeatedly violated in the name of medical progress. And even today, Black people have good reason to distrust the medical establishment. Studies show that Black patients receive inferior medical care compared to white patients. Black women are significantly more likely to die in childbirth than white women, even when controlling for income and education. Black people are underrepresented in clinical trials, but overrepresented in the diseases that disproportionately affect them. The legacy of medical racism is not ancient history. It's ongoing, and Henrietta Lacks' story is a crucial part of understanding that legacy. But Henrietta's story is also about resilience and legacy. Despite everything that was taken from her, despite the exploitation and the injustice, Henrietta's contribution to medicine is undeniable and enduring. Her cells have saved lives. They continue to save lives. Research using HeLa cells is ongoing right now, contributing to treatments for COVID-19, for cancer, for countless diseases. Henrietta's biological legacy is literally immortal. Her cells will outlive all of us. And now, thanks to Rebecca Skloot's book and the subsequent attention, Henrietta's memory is also preserved. She's not just a code name for a cell line. She's Henrietta Lacks, a woman with a life, a family, a story. She's recognized and honored. There are scholarships in her name. There are buildings named after her. Johns Hopkins, the hospital where her cells were taken, has apologized to her family and established programs to honor her legacy. Before I close, I want you to think about something. Every time you or someone you love gets a vaccine, every time medical treatment saves a life, there's a good chance that Henrietta Lacks' cells contributed to that treatment. Her cells are in you, in a sense. The research that keeps us healthy, that cures diseases, that pushes medicine forward, is built on contributions from countless people, many of whom never knew they were contributing and never received recognition. Henrietta Lacks is one example, but she represents something larger. She represents all the invisible people whose bodies, whose biological material, whose participation in medical trials, whose suffering even, has contributed to medical knowledge. We owe them recognition. We owe them respect. We owe them the ethical treatment that Henrietta didn't receive. And we need to learn from Henrietta's story. We need to insist on informed consent, on transparency in medical research, on fair treatment of research participants, on acknowledgement of the people whose contributions make medical progress possible. We need to address the medical racism that made Henrietta's exploitation possible and that continues to harm Black people in healthcare today. Henrietta Lacks deserves to be remembered not just as a cell line, but as a woman, a mother, a person whose life and death mattered. Her family deserves recognition and compensation for what was taken. And we all need to think carefully about medical ethics, about consent, about who profits from medical research, and who gets left behind. If this story made you angry, if it made you think about medical ethics and racial justice, if it made you want to honor Henrietta Lacks' memory properly, then I need you to act right now. Hit that like button to help this story reach more people. Subscribe to Crowned Black Heroes and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you these powerful untold stories. And drop a comment below. Tell me what you think. Did you know about Henrietta Lacks before watching this? What should be done to address medical exploitation and ensure ethical treatment of research participants? How do we honor the people whose bodies contribute to medical progress? Share this video everywhere. Make sure Henrietta Lacks' name is known, not just as HeLa cells, but as a woman who deserves recognition and respect. Make sure her story is taught in medical schools, in ethics classes, everywhere people learn about medicine and research, and support organizations working to address medical racism and ensure ethical treatment in healthcare. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about justice and medical ethics. Thank you for honoring Henrietta Lacks' memory. Her cells have saved billions of lives. Her story needs to be told so that the exploitation she experienced never happens again. Share her story. Demand medical ethics reform. support the fight for racial justice in healthcare, and join me next time for another powerful story. Until then, stay informed, stay committed to justice, and never forget the people whose invisible contributions changed our world. Peace.